persons affected by Hansen's disease and their family members all over the world. Excellencies, dear colleagues, I thank the organizers for the invitation to participate in such a momentous occasion. Religious communities have historically served as safety nets for persons affected by Hansen's disease worldwide. Given their capacity to influence mindsets and social practices, religious leaders can also play a key role in fighting all forms of discrimination, hatred, and violence, as well as in building peace and promoting dignity for all. Interfaith dialogue is highly relevant for overcoming harmful stereotypes about Hansen's disease and stigmatization against those affected. In a report that I presented to the General Assembly, I identified the persistence of traditional non-written customs and practices that discriminate against persons affected by Hansen's disease and which are grounded on beliefs coming from world or local religions. Cooperating with religious leaders is indeed one important action we can undertake. States, although the ones obliged to enforce international human rights law, usually fail to do so. The fact is that the majority of the good practices that I have mapped over these last 5 years were developed by civil society organizations. On this matter, allow me to highlight the leadership of His Holiness Pope Francis in defending the rights of persons affected by Hansen's disease, and I take this opportunity to thank the Holy See for cooperating with my mandate on this regard. Together with all of you, I worked hard for these last 5 years to identify the consequences of deep-rooted stigmatization and discrimination, report on them, and elaborate recommendations on how to mitigate and eliminate systemic discrimination. Despite progress, persons affected by Hansen's disease continue to experience discrimination in law and in practice. There are still more than 100 laws in place that discriminate against persons affected by Hansen's disease. Such laws violate a wide range of rights, and women are particularly harmed by them. Institutionalized discrimination at state services is also a shameful reality, one which often results from public servants not being educated on Hansen's disease and acting based on prejudice and harmful stereotypes. I have received reports of discrimination regarding access to public employment in healthcare, education, and social protection services and in the justice system. But the issue that worries me the most, and which is, I must be frank, the most difficult one to tackle, concerns the multiple barriers persons affected by Hansen's disease face to access opportunities on an equal basis with others, especially on the fields of decent work, health, education, higher education, and social protection. And this is precisely one of the issues that worry the most younger generations. Moreover, such systemic exclusion or structural violence, as some would call it, can menace the very right to life. Let me tell you the very sad story of a Brazilian boy who, in the words of my dear friend Faustino Pinto, died due to, and I quote, negligence from the government, structural invisibility, lack of coverage of primary health care, lack of public policies for Hansen's disease, lack of early diagnosis, lack of a multidisciplinary treatment for Hansen's disease, and lack of empathy. Faustino met João, not his real name, for the first time when João was 14 years old, although he looked like he was 8 years old, undernourished with a swollen belly and face due to the excessive use of steroids. His grandmother told Faustino other children bullied João. João ended up being hospitalized with Lucius phenomenon and spent 40 days in the hospital, turning 50 years old on top of a hospital bed, both of his legs amputated. At some point, his organs began to fail, and João died. Some will say this is a very rare case, and they are right, but still, I fully agree with Faustino's analysis about the structural causes behind the unforgivable and heartbreaking loss of this boy's life. On the other hand, we have seen progress in the elimination of interpersonal stigmatization. Yet, it seems to be quite difficult to eliminate interpersonal stigmatization in contexts where Hansen's disease is a rare disease. I recently received painful reports from a young man living in a country with nearly 0 cases. He cannot go to the healthcare services to get his medication because taxi drivers won't take him. People have taken photos of him and published those on social media just to bully him. However, he is not an isolated case. I strongly believe we need to develop strategies for supporting persons affected by Hansen's disease living in non-endemic countries. I recommend the creation of a task force of people from the national organizations of persons affected by Hansen's disease and with a mission to monitor and respond to discrimination globally. Progress is in course. We have seen progress in India regarding discriminatory laws. We have seen progress regarding a gender approach to Hansen's disease. We have seen progress on what concerns recognition of persons affected by Hansen's disease as persons who are entitled to disability rights. We have seen enormous progress on the interaction of the people's organizations with their respective governments and with international monitoring mechanisms. But progress, while real, seems to be too slow for those who continue to face so many barriers to a dignified life. We should bluntly acknowledge that despite our efforts, we are still not fulfilling people's rightful expectations. To exemplify how time seems to elude our efforts, let me tell you another story. Mr. Abel Almeida, a Portuguese national who is no longer among us and who was forcibly segregated into the last Portuguese Hansen's disease colony, decided together with a group of other inmates and after the discovery of a cure for Hansen's disease in the 1950s, to send a letter to the Holy See, humbly requesting the updating of references to leprosy in the Gospels in accordance with available scientific data. They did send the letter. And this year, the WHO has decided to change the name of monkeypox to mpox to prevent further stigmatization. So perhaps persons affected by Hansen's disease who have been claiming that something must be done about the stigmatization meanings attached to leprosy from as early as the 1950s have a point. So how do we beat the passage of time? As I have mentioned before, the majority of good practices are developed and implemented by civil society organizations. NGOs have been filling many and substantial gaps and have also been implementing important strategies for peer-to-peer support and improvement of people's mental health, economic empowerment, solidarity economy, among other key matters. Besides some strategies in the field of health and reparation measures that are in place only in 2 countries, Brazil and Japan, governments don't seem to be so active, to say it politely. No one has expressed so nicely the placid inaction of governments as one of the persons from our community who I admire the most and who recently expressed to me her frustration for constantly complaining to the government and always being answered with a laconic "that is already being taken care of," without her being able to see any corresponding action on the ground. In order to overcome this bottleneck, I suggest we learn from the organizations of persons affected by Hansen's disease, but also invest more on their development, both as individuals and collectivities. As an example, here are 3 things I have learned with them and which I consider best practices for eliminating discrimination. 1. Start from below. While people's organizations can act and advocate on different scales, they always ground their action and advocacy at the community level. They engage all the members of local communities, from schools to traditional and community leaders, women and so forth, and bet on change at the micro level. 2. Partner with other groups who experience similar patterns of subordination. Strategic cooperation based on horizontal relations between different groups with common concerns can be very effective in putting public pressure upon governments on specific matters and demanding for accountability and change. I was particularly happy to see persons affected by different entities at this event. The fields of entities and disability are our natural allies, since they share many of the causes and consequences of disease, disability, and discrimination. And the more we are, the stronger we can be. 3. Strategic litigation. All fundamental rights are justiciable, meaning we can go into court and demand for our rights if states fail to enforce them. We have already seen important victories at the courts in India and Brazil with practical impact. Fighting back power is never easy, and also on this we have much to learn from the people's organizations. When a dear friend asked me many years ago, what have I learned from Hansen's disease, among other things, I told him that one of the things I have learned from the grassroots was that social struggle involves many hardships and activists make enormous personal sacrifices, but that the energy that sustains them comes not only from ideological commitment, but also from the unique empathy between people who come together as kindred spirits to fight political and social battles. Indeed, in a collective struggle, spirituality is not out of place. It plays a role through the sharing of beliefs and the strengthening of resilience with faith. If we would be so humble as to learn from the people's organizations, we would benefit from learning that what nourishes struggles daily are not material benefits nor honors, but the spiritual bond that comes from sharing a broader notion of social justice that reconnects human dignity and the human soul. However, make no mistake, this can only happen between people who have established horizontal relations among themselves. So while we fight back power outside, I invite us all to look at power inside our community. Aren't we still working under a provider-beneficiary paradigm? Are we really trying to break dependency relations? Can we do more to promote equality and join together, affected and non-affected, as people who, while diverse, possess equal knowledge, capacities, and potential to fight back power? Once again, I make an appeal for us all to bet on self-determination and truly promote horizontality as a new relationship paradigm. Thank you very much.